we are delighted that you could find time to be with us again on another Tuesday, where we dive into the Global Compact for Migration objectives as part of the certificate program that the 4 organizations are offering. So we know that we have among 133 participants in the room, we have students, but we also know that we have friends of the various organizations that are trying to move forward, find time to be sensitizing on another various groups on the Global Compact for Migration. I would just request that we have our microphones muted. It's always very nice to see everyone, because we all don't get the opportunity to get around and travel. So your videos can be on, but we ask that you keep your microphones muted until we ask you to take the floor. So without much further ado, maybe let me just ask William, would you like to just kick us off? I know that we are having the back-to-back webinars here, particularly for the students, to give a bit of context to how we move from the People's Migration Challenge and to the topic that we have today on Global Compact for Migration, objective number 6, looking at fair recruitment. William, over to you.
All right, thanks, Paddy, and thanks everyone, and also to Rebecca and Shabri for being part of this panel, Kimberly for being part of this panel today. Just to say, this is, yes, back to back with what is called the People's Migration Challenge. This is a series of webinars that began somewhere last year at the beginning of the COVID, looking at the 23 objectives, and it's gone through several iterations, what we call rounds. And today we kick-started the 5th round kind of thing. And from looking at the 23 objective, we've narrowed down to 5 areas that are of significant importance to us as civil society. Today, we had a discussion on the first of those thematic areas, which is a new social contract. The idea of a new social contract was posed largely by trade unions and civil society in this at the beginning of the COVID, when the whole situation of essential workers came or emerged or was recognized at the global level, on the global scene, at the global stage kind of thing. And it is then that we saw flaws in the programs of labor migration, but also we saw huge challenges in terms of what migrant workers were experiencing. Not only migrant workers who had crossed borders, but in many instances, internal migrants as well. And so trade unions and civil society throughout the world came together to call for a new social contract that responds, that is able to respond to situations like what we are seeing now in terms of the COVID pandemic, but also as a way to say that the fundamentals of the social contract need to be re-looked at again in order to be able to respond to the current challenges of our time. And one of the bigger discussions that came out of the International Labour Conference at the end of its concluding session this year was the need for social protection for all. So there are many dimensions to the new social contract. I won't delve into that. People in the call, in the webinar, have already looked at it and we've discussed it. But one of the elements of a new social contract would be this notion of ethical recruitment, fair and ethical recruitment. It's become a mantra almost in labor migration discourse today. But what does that mean? And then interestingly, when you look for the evidence on the ground of where is it happening, where is it happening? Where can you find an ethical recruiter who follows exactly what are the guidelines put out by the IOM in its IRIS program or by the ILO in its fair recruitment principle, guiding principles? It's difficult to find the evidence on the ground. And maybe this discussion today, led by Shabri and Kimberly and Rebecca, will throw light on how the two issues do come together. Part of the new social contract is a different way of doing things. of re-looking at the foundations and solidifying them or making them stronger so that workers are not left at the lowest end of the bargaining chip kind of thing, but workers have their rights, have their dignity, and have the protection of the decent work program that the ILO promotes. What we will have to do in looking at a new social contract, which is a conversation of people's migration challenge and fair and ethical recruitment, is to see that at least within labor migration discourse, recruitment is the first pillar of that migration journey. Of course, there is the pre-departure orientation and all, but recruitment is that whole process, which can be a very empowering one for the migrant worker, which can then go on and determine the rest of his or her life in the migration journey, or it could be a very debilitating, exploitative one. This needs to change. And this is what the new social contract is about. And I'm glad we have Shabri and Kimberly and Rebecca who will take us through this conversation. For those of us who were part of the previous conversation, they will now say what are some of the underpinnings of this new social contract, some of the elements of it in fair and ethical recruitment. Thank you so much again for joining us. And thanks, Patty. Over to you.
Thank you, William. In setting that context, I think it's important. We already see that even getting messages, I think in the chat about what is the difference between the two sessions, and one would say, I think one would say it's important to look at the interlinkages, which is why for us the People's Migration Challenge predominantly remains very important. So we don't look at the Global Compact for Migration objectives as standalone objectives, but that are really operating and working together. And I think you have given us the importance of those interlinkages. So thanks again, William, for just.
Paddy, unmute.
I'm so sorry. Did you hear anything that I had to say? Not at all. Today is the day of the mute button. So something happens with my computer that it decides to mute itself. So apologies for that. I said a lot of things, but maybe just to say that thank you again, William, for setting the tone for us today and for just highlighting also for the students to see the difference, not the difference, but rather the interconnection between the two. For us, with the Global Compact for Migration Study or the certificate program, we are looking at them as individual objectives, but we are often talking about what those interlinkages are like. And I think you have just done an excellent job at laying the foundation for us to see how they're interconnected. So the next 5 weeks will be very interesting, I think, for students and ourselves to follow in the People's Migration Challenge. And on this, let's just then move on to today's deliberation. We don't have as much time as we usually have, and we are going to zero in and just have a deep dive into the Global Compact for Migration objective number 6 on fair recruitment and decent work, and to deliberate on this, or to kind of shed light on what this objective tries or at least intends to achieve, and what it looks like in its implementation today. We have 3 panelists that will be joining us in time, and I will introduce them as we are going along, but we're very happy to have Shabri Naya, who's joining us from the International Labour Organization, where he's the Labour Migration Specialist, and we also have Rebecca Smith, who will join us also later from the Labour Mobility Partnership, as well as Kimberly Geronimo. Please correct me, Kimberly, if I didn't get it right there. But just let's kick off with Kimberly. Kim, we know that your work as an associate, a senior associate at the labor mobility partnerships, and before this, we understand that you've worked with the World Bank, for instance, in looking at the impact of labor market interventions in developing countries, as well as working, for instance, in Chile. We understand you've done an assessment there that was trying to look at access to public health and education and infrastructure for low-income Chilean families. Of course, that interconnection as well. But then we also read from your profile that you have a concurrent master's in public administration from Harvard Kennedy School, and as well as the Harvard School of Design. Apologies for that. So we just wanted maybe to get a sense from some of the work and the research that you have done at the labor mobility partnerships, in setting the tone for this objective. Do you want to walk us through, when we talk about, often we talk in this space around standards and certifications. Would you like to talk to us a bit about sort of the market-based strategies that you think are important in terms of supporting fair and ethical recruitment, and both looking at them in terms of how they increase the scale and sustainability? Kim, over to you.
Absolutely. Can you all hear me okay? Fantastic. Yes. Well, wonderful to be here, and thank you for that introduction. So for a bit of background for everyone, Labor Mobility Partnerships is a nonprofit organization that is really dedicated to improving and expanding opportunities for economic well-being and prosperity through labor mobility. So we essentially believe that in sort of wealthier countries, there are demographic changes that are creating an aging population. So you have labor shortages. And then in generally lower income countries, you have many working age people who could benefit greatly from being able to go to some of these wealthier countries and work there. And what we have seen is that, so you have benefits for the workers, you have benefits for the sending country in terms of remittances, and you have benefits for the receiving country in terms of they have labor shortages, and that helps their economies. But there are many policy barriers as well as implementation barriers to having more opportunities and safer opportunities for workers. And so at LAMP, that's what we call the Labor Mobility Partnerships, LAMP, we not only want more doors open in terms of policy, but we want good implementation of those programs. So you can have a policy, but if that program is not implemented in a safe, orderly way, then you don't see these wonderful, or what we would argue are potentially very great benefits for workers, because they are at risk of exploitation and abuse. And the recruitment industry is one of those sort of implementers or facilitators of programs. And so that is one of the reasons why LAMP is very concerned about making sure that recruitment happens in a safe way that protects workers, so that we can achieve the potential, the welfare potential and the benefits for workers that labor mobility could hold. And so one of the things that we have noticed, and I'm going to speak specifically to a particular corridor where we're working, but we do think that there are broader applications. So one of the things we've noticed is that in general, with recruitment, to date, there has been a lot of very important work that's been done on creating standards around good practice, fair and ethical recruitment, creating certifications and trainings for recruiters to help them become more responsible. What we have seen less of is interventions to help responsible recruiters become competitive in the market and more profitable, so that they can scale quicker and gain a market share more quickly than otherwise. And so let me make this very concrete in terms of a program where we're working. So we have a portfolio of work around strengthening responsible recruitment or ethical and fair recruitment within the H-2A program. So the H-2A visa program is a circular mobility program, which allows workers, primarily from Mexico, although it's not limited to that, to go to the US for a limited period of time, around 9 months, to help with the seasonal harvest. And then they return to Mexico and they can come back. So that's why it's circular. And there is just, it's an employer demand-driven program. So if the employers don't, like this program or want the workers, then the program doesn't exist. So employer demand is very important to having this program work and having these opportunities exist for workers. But it's extremely fragmented. So the employer demand is just very, very fragmented. It's sort of each employer applying for visas and workers on their own. And then the recruitment market in Mexico is very fragmented. So you have many, many different types of recruiters, very informal, lots of sub-agents. So the visibility into what is actually happening on the ground is very difficult. And so speaking to William's point about, so what does fair and ethical recruitment look like in this context? We have done some very intensive engagement with a number of recruiters, especially one responsible recruiter who has a very robust community-based recruitment program where they actually recruit through trusted NGOs that already work in communities and do not have ulterior motives, so to speak, church organizations, migrant rights organizations. So they, recruit through these NGOs, and then they have a third-party monitoring system which follows the worker throughout the recruitment and employment period, and periodically requests information from that worker in an anonymous way, so that they can really make sure that at no point along the way was there abuse or exploitation. So this is a really promising model, and we have done some sort of financial modeling, and because the H-2A program, it is widely accepted that the employer pays for recruitment, which does not exist in all corridors. So that's why I want to be context specific. But because of that, this third-party monitoring we've modeled out does not add on a substantial additional cost. So what that means is that you can have very responsible recruitment at a relatively competitive price for the client, which is very promising and very exciting, and something that we really want to use to our advantage. And so one of the things that we have noticed about trainings and certifications is that they are critical, but they oftentimes require a upfront cost for recruiters. And then the benefit or the benefits you reap are uncertain and very long-term. And so this doesn't create a much incentive for most recruiters to actually invest. And so what we want to do is kind of flip this and say, all right, with responsible recruiters, how can we help them become more profitable, more competitive? And so what we've seen is that because some of the most ethical and fair recruiters that exist out there have invested so much energy and really expertise into the good practice model, where we think that we can come and help and help them succeed more is more on sort of the business side of things. And so, for example, how can we help them, improve their operational efficiency so that reduces their costs and they become more price competitive? How can we help them approach their marketing and client acquisition strategy from a different angle to appeal to clients outside of the moral appeal? How can we use new technologies to either increase their delivery capacity, for example, so they can scale up more quickly? And how can we improve, negotiate good terms on access to capital so that can ease many credit constraints that a lot of recruiters face? And that can actually incentivize, can actually lead recruiters to require fees from workers to kind of finance those upfront costs because they get paid later on. And then how can we help them develop strategic partnerships with other organizations that offer different services that are relevant to the client, that creates like a package of solutions that really goes beyond just recruitment and kind of solves many problems for the employer at once. And so this whole intervention that's really focused around becoming more, market competitive, so to speak, is really about how can we increase the value proposition of responsible recruiters to employers beyond just the moral ethical argument, which of course should be enough, but as we have seen in almost all contexts, is usually not. And so what we believe is that if we can create and cultivate a niche market of competitive and profitable responsible recruiters, then essentially that niche sector is poised to break into the larger market. And that's what we really want. We want to reach a tipping point where ethical and fair recruitment is market feasible, is attractive to employers, and it's possible it's a slightly higher cost, but you've created all of these different benefits around it so that the value proposition for employers is larger, is better than standard or unethical recruitment. And that's the key, is how can we increase that value proposition? So we believe that if we can do this, and we have reason to believe that in a context like the H2A program, that's possible, you can really create, you can essentially help responsible recruiters scale in a sustainable way, because if the employers want it and if it's a good service, then that should happen naturally through market forces. So that's what we're really excited about, and that's where we see this kind of market approach as being a great value add to all of the existing work that is already happening around standards and certification and education. So I'll pause there, but open to questions or conversation.
Thanks, Kimberly. And I was listening with and taking down a lot of notes, because this sounds pretty interesting, and in a way, I think in response to what William had been talking about, is what we have seen. I think often what you hear is impossible, isn't it? That how do we then transfer those costs? I think there has been a lot of emphasis on looking at the transfer of the recruitment costs. Where do we really move the recruitment costs? And I see that the work that you're doing is also changing the model of how recruiters would work, right? And I think that's kind of a paradigm shift, as one would say. And I'm just wondering, as we'll come back to you in a moment, if that would be possible, or we would cross over then to Rebecca in a bit. But I will go to Shabri in a bit. But something to think about, Kimberly, is sort of, so in this space, you talked about some things that seem for me as like prevailing conditions, so things that have to be present. So we're talking about in a space where there's an actual pathway. So I want to kind of pose a challenge to say, how does this work in the space where there is no legal pathway? Do we really see this incentive for recruiters to sort of work in this space and then in this way? I know it's opening a whole different dimension as well, but it's sort of bringing to you what the reality actually also looks like, right? That there may not be an actual legal pathway. And so I'm also begging the question to see how then do you see the role of governments, for instance, and regulators of recruitment agencies? How do they come into this space to ensure that that the migrant remains, the migrant's rights remain protected and they remain guaranteed for the migrant? And you talked about the use of technologies as well. And I thought that maybe it would be interesting to dive in just a little bit more to understand what that actually means. And, to which extent are we talking more into business operations? Are we talking more also on the protection side for the migrant as well? And the linkages, of course, that are happening when I talk about governments is also looking at the role that embassies, for instance, and labor attaches in embassies have to play in a space like this. So very interesting to hear about this, and thanks for that presentation. I would just cross over very briefly then to Shabri, and good to see that you've already opened your video there. And just as I introduce Shabri, he's the labor migration specialist for South Asia, and he's based in ILO's Decent Work Technical Support Team and based in New Delhi. And he covers quite a range of countries in that sub-region. And before that, we would talk also a little bit about some of the work that Shabri has done around the Global Compact for Migration really going to the early beginnings and understanding what those negotiations look like as he was working around that for ILO, but also in your capacity, your previous capacity working, for instance, with donors that support a lot of different work around migration and development and labor migration rather, and also looking at sort of these, regional intergovernmental dialogue and processes and how those support, for instance, skills partnerships. So Shabri, we're glad that you are here with us. So maybe just to kick you to be very precise and succinct, for the benefit of our students, it would be good to understand, where do we position ILO in all of this? When we talk about fair recruitment, and decent work, where do we position ILO vis-a-vis the governments, vis-a-vis the partnerships that you have? When I hear ILO, I also hear trade unions, I hear private sector. How does that all blend in? Over to you.
Thanks so much, Patty. What an absolute pleasure. First things first, big thanks to you and William and the organizers for inviting me to this conversation. And I see that Professor Binod Kadri has turned on his camera as well. So always a pleasure to see you, Binod sir. Right, Patty, where do we position, or how do we position the ILO in this conversation, right? The first thing is this: the ILO is the only tripartite UN organization, which means that there is no conversation on labor that is absent from the ILO's strategic realm. Any aspect of labor is discussed in the ILO's strategic realm with the understanding that it brings together governments, employers, and trade unions together. Trade unions as representatives of the worker, and employers as those organizations that actually recruit and are supposed to provide decent work or productive jobs to the worker. So what better organization than the ILO in this context? If we go back into the history of the ILO and the framing of its constitution 102 years back, the ILO's constitution talks about the protection of the rights of workers in countries other than their own. Right there has been a very clear appreciation for what the ILO can bring in to this conversation. Let me give you concrete examples rather than theoretical perspectives. The ILO last year did a survey with the government of Bangladesh in identifying what costs and recruitment costs and related fees migrant workers pay, or workers pay to migrate to another country. Now, I presume you have a global audience here, and in this conversation, I can also, let me also presume that there are quite a few from South Asia, right? In that context, I'm sure, again, a lot of South Asians would automatically relate to the fact that there is somebody either within their families or people they know who have migrated to the Middle East. The Middle East being the biggest corridor from, or biggest destination side for South Asian migrant workers. In this study with the government of Bangladesh, the Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics, with the ILO, we discovered that migrant workers pay an average of 17.6 months. So that's 17.5 months of their wages as recruitment fees and related costs. And I'm so glad I say this with my video on, because I can see Anite with his mouth open going, wow, Shabri, really? Absolutely. 17.5 months. So that's a year and a half of your wages are going as recruitment fees and related costs in a country like Bangladesh for migrant workers. And thank God for the support of the government of the Bangladesh on this, who said, look, we have to identify these costs. before we identify or before we define policies. And that's how the ILO got in to help them in this survey. This was perhaps the best decision that we took because it helped us in going back with the government of Bangladesh in revisiting their policies vis-a-vis migrant workers. So that is a way that the ILO can position itself in the context of migrant workers' rights, particularly in the context of fair recruitment. Let me give you another example. In the context of bilateral labor migration agreements, the ILO facilitated a bilateral agreement between the governments of Nepal and Jordan for the recruitment of women migrant workers in the garment industry from Nepal working in Jordan. The idea was to say, we can use this bilateral agreement to be able to reduce costs as a whole for women workers going to Jordan from Nepal. Now, this was a tremendous perspective that we were actually able to capitalize on. So about 200 workers, if not more, were able to migrate without paying any costs from Nepal to Jordan to work in the garment sector there. Women workers, the more vulnerable amongst the migrant workers. I'm not saying that that worked in its entirety, because after a while, we realized that the problem was not just in the recruitment costs, but also in the fact that a bilateral labor migration agreement required the political will of both the governments of Nepal and Jordan to be absolutely, in absolute terms, to be implemented. And that necessarily was not happening, right? Nonetheless, both the governments have taken it on to say, right, that's an area that we need to fix. And here's something that the ILO is supporting as well. Let me give you a third example of where the ILO has come in. And this example is one that most of you would have associated with in the form of the Football World Cup. Next year, Qatar is hosting, around this time, the 2022 soccer, or football as we say in South Asia, World Cup. And the 2022 World Cup demanded the government of Qatar to put together a number of stadiums and a lot of other infrastructure activities for which they needed migrant workers. And there were a lot of issues that were coming out as a result of that particular highlight event. What in turn that led to was the fact that the government of Qatar, with the support of the ILO, instituted tremendous policies that changes the entire understanding of migration to the Middle East. What did they do? One, they said that workers will not be bonded to any one employer all the time. And I'm putting it in very simple terms here so that our audience can understand it. Because in 9 out of 10 cases, workers are under a sponsorship law, and that sponsorship binds them to the employer. So the first thing that the government of Qatar said is, remove that. So that does not exist anymore. Second, they said every worker should get a minimum wage of 1,000 Qatari riyals, irrespective of where that worker is coming from or what sector that worker is in, including for domestic workers where a lot of women migrant workers are in. And finally, the government of Qatar also said that 95% of the workers of any company, with the exception of top management, can leave the country without the permission of their employer. It's what they called exit permit. An exit permit was required for the worker to leave the country. And that exit permit was taken away for majority of the workers in any given company. These three policies, what we can say would be, well, it's normal. Now we should have had these policies right from the beginning. I mean, why does it have to have a World Cup or for the ILO to be engaged? But the fact that it happened, leading into a highlight event like the Football World Cup goes to show the fact that the ILO can come in here in a space such as this, which is extremely sensitive, very complicated, in being able to introduce very strong policies and reforms that actually go down to the benefit of the worker. I'll stop there, Patty, for that question.
Shabri, thanks very much for just really opening and giving us a very clear view, I think, both from what the policy framework looks like in very simple but very practical terms. I think for us, bringing it down also to the migrant and what that actually means in terms of protection measures, in terms of what's available. And I'm just wondering, maybe we can have you back in a moment again, where you speak to us. So ILO has existed even before the Global Compact for Migration was there. And, in 2018, this was felt as though, regardless of the work that, the extensive work that ILO does and many other partners that work with ILO, this came as an objective, meaning that we still have a lot of work that we need to do around all these different agreements and around some of the shining examples that we have. And of course, also in the context of new challenges that we have in terms of, economic pressures going on countries that receive a lot of labor migrants, or rather people that are moving for work. And that shrinking space, something is going to happen around that shrinking space. And the question is, how do we ensure then that we still are able, as governments, as actors working together with governments, you are able to facilitate that fair recruitment and actually also safeguard the conditions like you have highlighted in the Qatari example of these migrant workers. So I think it would be very interesting for us to hear sort of that perspective looking forward. Why do we still have this as a problem? Why do we still have this issue if we have a strong arm of the ILO, if we have a strong civil society, if we also have strong research work that's coming out, like Lamp has just explained to us, why are we still at this point where we still have things that we're grappling with? And maybe the question also is, what are we actually grappling with? You talked about a political will, and that would be interesting to sort of digest it and break it down a little bit. I thought that I could bring on Rebecca. I see Laxman, you'd like to come in. You just give us a moment. In a few minutes, we will cross over to the audience. Thanks for being present here with us. Rebecca, I wondered if you wanted to just reflect back on some of those questions that we had posed to Kim.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you so much for having us here today. Lovely to be here with you all. And I think you really have a great pairing between ourselves at LAMP and Shabri from the ILO, talking about their, of course, like very long-standing expertise and leadership in this area. So as Kim kind of framed, and sorry, I should apologize on her behalf that she's had to step to another meeting. Kim is leading our work on responsible recruitment, but happens to currently be in Mexico doing that work. So I'm stepping in on her behalf for the rest of today's session. But as Kim kind of framed up, what we as LAMP like to think about is really kind of to your last point of why haven't all of these efforts in kind of the regulatory space and the retail space over the course of now kind of decades really translated into transforming the entire recruitment industry. And one of the things that we would say is that there's actually what's been missing is good, really kind of capable examples of actual responsible recruiters operating in practice. And that's kind of what William teed up for us at the very beginning. And then you asked a lot of great, really kind of nuanced questions, Patty. And the first thing I'll be very honest with is that these are things that we are kind of working on teasing out and testing through our work right now. So I'm happy to tell you our hypotheses, and then I hope we can kind of all reconvene in a year or two and we'll tell you what we've learned. So to your first question about what to do when there's no legal pathways, yeah, we can't pretend that this is a solution, that like building responsible recruiters who are able to outcompete irresponsible recruiters, that can really only operate in the context of a formal legal pathway for that market-based competition to happen, right? So this isn't a solution to that, realistically. I would offer you two responses. The first is, our kind of end game as LAMP is actually that we want more legal pathways. And I think that's really a critical element in moving towards ethical, responsible recruitment, is having sufficient legal pathways so that people can move regularly, right? So that would be my first answer. But my second answer, and how we hope that this can play out kind of in the meantime, is kind of making it a bit more of a virtuous cycle, in that when you have economies like here in the US right now, we, as Kim mentioned, we're working in the US H2A program in agriculture. While the H2A is an important part of US agriculture markets, it's obviously actually dominated that market by irregular workers here in the US. And so what happens then is that actually drags down the labor conditions for everyone, because when the legal worker, or the workers here on kind of documented visas, are trying to advocate for themselves in better conditions, there's this competition, in a sense, with the terms under which the undocumented workers are operating. So we're hoping to flip the script on that a bit. And, you know, this can only be at the margin, but at least moving in the right direction of saying, if we are able to move the documented workers through responsible channels. So they have, as we've seen through our work with responsible recruiters here, they have greater self-advocacy, they're able to negotiate for better terms for themselves. That actually kind of rising tide lifts all boats, is a saying here, that actually helps even the undocumented workers to also advocate for better conditions for themselves. So while we're not necessarily proposing a direct solution for them, we are hopeful and hypothesize that there will be a bit of a positive interaction effect between those two. And then quickly responding to your last two questions, actually on the role of government, I would say that Shabri has really answered that far more beautifully than I could myself. And for our part, we would largely say there is a very, very important role of regulation in sort of creating that framework that both pushes towards responsible recruitment and, of course, you know, disincentivizes and enforces against irresponsible recruitment, but also that kind of creates the conditions under which responsible recruitment can emerge in a market competitive, business friendly way so that it can outcompete the bad actors. But what I would also say is that the ILO and other organizations like it really have very long-standing expertise in there and kind of very much leading on that forefront. So for our part, we would say that there's a lot of focus on that regulation and a lot of like really well-established expertise. And what we're hoping to do is say, great, when you have regulations in place, how can you kind of pair that by using business practices to organically grow the responsible recruitment? So how can we kind of mirror up these two practices, marry them up, and work together to take over the whole market? And then my last question, answering your last question very quickly on technology, it's of course not a silver bullet. As I'm sure this group has seen in many cases, that, you know, technology can't solve things if there are underlying structural problems. What we're hoping to do is kind of pair up looking at the structural problems with using technology to, one, bring greater visibility in. I think, as we're probably all familiar, one of the big problems in the recruitment chain is there's a lot of really small actors and no one even knows, you know, who they're working with, who's charging the money, who's responsible and can be held accountable. So you can use technology to, what we would say, kind of vertically integrate or bring that recruitment channel all into one process with a lot greater transparency and visibility. And so, you know, some examples of that could be using, I know there's, for example, in Saudi, the e-Musaned channel, or I believe India uses e-Migrate, that brings it all into one electronic portal. Now, you still have to have really kind of strong non-digital practices around that, but that's one option for bringing everything into one space and increasing the transparency. And when you have those kind of broader platforms, it also makes it easier to work with employers, in our case, growers, to say, like, look, here's a viable solution, go with this instead of these irresponsible actors. So that's how we're hoping and seeing that play out. But again, you know, check back with us in a year or two.
Well, good luck. I think it's some very interesting work, and you know, and the potential for scale would be something maybe we can hear in your wrap-up remarks. You know, when we come back from that Q&A, because I think, you know, thinking about the different, you know, now it's the big wave of skills mobility partnerships, right? And we're sort of trying to think, how does that then filter in? You know, what's coming sort of first, and how do you position then a model such as the one that you're proposing that still tries, first of all, is very much aligned to global frameworks and some of the indicators that we've been trying to move forward, moving costs away from migrant workers and back into the spaces where it should be, so being paid by employers, but also understanding what it means for a recruitment agency to operate. I mean, for a long time, we've been saying cut recruitment costs, but also knowing that, recruitment agencies are running a business. So it is a business. And so how do they become profitable? And kind of this change of the business model, and how your work then comes in the space of kind of bigger, skills mobility partnerships. We see them mushrooming in different places. There's even some that are looked at more of a continental level, it seems as though. And I guess more and more, we will see that popping up as COVID is showing us that labor can be found in different spaces. And it's about, facilitating people to move rather than inhibiting their movement, hopefully so. Shabri, can I come to you before we go to the Q&A, or sort of on your reflections on those small questions that we gave?
One of the things, building on what Rebecca's just said, and if I were to take in the whole idea of market forces, and Rebecca, I'm not an economist, so forgive me for this, but I love the way you put it. I'll never be able to explain it the way you can. Here's the thing, in the context of, let's just say, market forces, right? When I grew up in the Middle East, and when my father went to the Middle East to work as a migrant worker from India, he went there. He was selected on the basis of the fact that he got to the interview on time. That was the basis, because they said, oh, this man's punctual, we'll recruit him. He didn't pay any costs. This was in 1975. But that was also a time when it was much more about the demand and the kind of skills they needed and the kind of workers they wanted. The Middle Eastern countries were all just becoming independent, right? The late 60s, early 70s was when majority of the Gulf states, for instance, actually gained independence. And they were booming. They discovered oil, and there was a need for workers. On the other hand, today the situation is one where we have got more workers at disposal than necessarily in terms of jobs. So you can pick and choose, right? And so market forces and the demand and supply actually contributes to recruitment that is not fair and ethical. So if that is the case, how do we change that element of making sure that there is fair recruitment? Simple. I may say this is simple, but governments may disagree with me. What is it that I think could be one way of doing it? Can we ensure that there is a better regional understanding? For instance, a migrant worker from India pays a different rate in the context of recruitment cost or fees than a migrant worker from Bangladesh for the same job. A migrant worker from Bangladesh pays a different cost to the migrant worker from Nepal. Can there be a better regional understanding in this context? However, the governments in the region would tell me, are you living in utopian land, Mr. Nair? Because as far as we are concerned, it is about our market. It is about our sovereignty. It's about our workers and our nationals who need to get better. Right. So that means you have a situation which inadvertently leads to competition between countries, right? To attract labor markets in countries of destination. And this competition is massive, was massive in the context of the pre-COVID era. Can you imagine what it will be like now when labor migration resumes in all its glory as Emirates and Qatar Airways and all these big airlines start taking off, air bubbles are dropped, people can move much more freely. And there is a much more easier understanding to the kind of needs of jobs that are there. I, coming to Switzerland on mission, on work, had to take 3 RT-PCR tests. That is going to become a cost that will be attached to the migrant worker. And that cost, how many employers will pay for that cost, is where governments can certainly take a strong measure and a policy on. Can the government say, clearly, anybody who comes into our country needs an RT-PCR test, but they're coming here to work, the employer has to cover that cost or reimburse that migrant worker for those costs. So that is a simple way of doing these things. A second example, and I'll stop there, Patty, is specifically in the context of bilateral labor migration agreements. We're living once again in an era where we constantly hear about air bubbles, right? The country that I come from, India, has an air bubble, I think, or has air bubbles with about 18 or 19 different countries. It is even a way to change air travel in the post-COVID era, right? That comes as a result of bilateral labor migration agreements. That bilateral agreement, when enforced properly, keeping in mind or keeping the migrant worker in the centrality of it, will help not only benefit the migrant worker, but also the countries themselves. So as an example, can we reset our conversations with regards to bilateral labor migration agreements like the one that I mentioned in the Nepal-Jordan corridor? Can we be very clear as to what we want to expect from these agreements in the context of migrants' rights? Can we say very clearly now that a migrant worker's contract should be adhered to? If there is a recruitment agent that is involved in the recruitment of that migrant worker, can it be very clearly stated that the migrant worker will not pay any costs, that it is the employer pays model that will be adopted in that contract, that it will not be the migrant worker that pays? I am very privileged to be working for an organization that's over 100 years old. But if you asked me to pay even a day's cost or a day's wages to the ILO to recruit me, I'll say thanks, but no thanks. So why should a migrant worker pay for it, right? So if we can address these situations within bilateral agreements, there's nothing like it. And there again, the ILO is in the process of preparing global guidance and tools. There are many such examples like these, Paddy, but we will certainly need more than an hour, and we have 5 minutes to go for audience Q&A. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shabri. I think you touched on some very important ones there. And when you were saying we, my question was going to be, who is we? And I think you have answered the question. The emphasis goes back again to the migrant. Why, as all these costs are coming up related to COVID, as the business model is changing, as COVID measures are changing for people moving up and down, and we know migrants need to be moved from one place to another. Who is covering the additional costs that are coming? I mean, it's just even additional flight costs that are there, costs that are related to quarantine and all these other questions. And like you said, I work as a consultant, and often if I'm told that, could you come to this country? And I say, well, there's a lot of things to take care of. And all of a sudden, then there's a cost. And before you know it, we're doing something virtually and we're done within a couple of months. So, but then, we are at an advantage where I have a kind of work, and many do, where you can work virtually. And yet, we still have quite a large number of people who need to be able to move. And those associated costs need to be taken care of by somebody. And then I also come to the issue that sometimes it's a force of habit, isn't it? I mean, I'm thinking about it even in my country, in Zambia, when you have to get domestic workers that would be coming from the rural areas. It's somehow a given, and it's a legend that goes, and it's something that's been very difficult to break, that a recruitment cost is almost as though it's a thank you to the person who connects you. So it started as somebody connecting you to the job, and now it's part of the tradition. You have, situations where security companies are hiring personnel that are coming from rural areas, and bank cards are being passed on with passwords to other individuals, and they would say, well, that's absolutely fine. He helped me get the job. At the end of the month, he has access to my bank account. I only need a bit. I mean, it's how do we break down some of these cultures that we have? And we're talking about, in this case, it's internal migration. What happens when it has to happen even across, and the kind of vulnerabilities that we expose migrants to? So I think some of the things are very important as you're unpacking to us, but our audience would like to come in. Lashman, can I let you, can I unmute you? I think I've already done so. Please go ahead and take the floor. And then after that, Mr. Basie.
Thank you, Paddy. I appreciate what Brother Shabri Nair said about Nepal and Jordan corridor and Nepal and bilateral agreement with Qatar. And now the Qataris are coming to Nepal again in next 2 weeks to have another agreement. Unfortunately, whatever the bilateral agreements are happening between two countries, it never been applied in the ground reality. It's the ground reality is too different than what the agreement is. And with this, yes, I agree with Brother Shabri that those who go to Jordan don't pay any recruitment fee. But the fact is, the wages are so low and the working conditions are so difficult. Even ILO has recognized, the Kathmandu ILO has, and I would like to let Brother Shabri Nair say, listen to this, that I was very much involved with the government when the government stopped not taking the ILO's recommendation for the recruiter. Somebody from Australia was a recruiter, and I was a sort of a negotiator between ILO and the government to go through the ILO's recommendation for the recruiter. So I know what has happened. But the fact is, the wages are so low and the working conditions are so difficult that girls don't want to go back again to the Jordan, and they are coming back. As far as I know about Qatar, just now while this seminar is going on, I heard on BBC that in the light of next year's 2022 football or soccer, the workers are getting much more squeezed by their employer in the process of wages and so many other things. And there is a huge cry about the wage not being paid, not only during this COVID-19, but previously, and the post-pandemic right now and pre-pandemic also. I would like to request ILO that why don't they have a fact-finding mission in Qatar, exactly whether the agreement is implemented in the ground level. There are 3 agreements there, one from Nepal to the airlines. And then when they get to Qatar, then the whole agreement is changed. And when they reach the workplace, there's another agreement. So there's things are still happening the same way. And we don't care about how much the workers pay or how much it costs them. The net result should be, it's a 2 years contract, and how much do they bring? And are they coming safe? Are they coming safe home? Not in boxes or not wheelchair or not mentally sick. So it's about time that this webinar should think about the social cost of the whole migration into Qatar. I would like to tell you one thing very clearly. No government would like to make fight with the country of destination there. I mean, because there is a competition for sending migrant workers. And the recruiter has often said, even today, they are saying that we have to pay to get the orders. It's a huge amount of money. They would tell this thing on our faces that we pay there to get the recruitment orders. There's so much competition. Why don't the South Asian come together, the governments and the workers and the trade unions come together and have a negotiation, bilateral framework agreement with the GCC countries, like Brother Sabri said, equal pay. When I was there in Qatar some time ago, the Indian guy told me, hey, Lakshman, your government is so weak that you cannot make a negotiation. Look, this guy, the Nepali guy, he works on 45th floor of the scaffolding. And if he gets dropped from there, he dies. So am I. I will also die from the 45th floor. And this Nepali guy is a very good worker. And ask your government to make a good negotiation. We get paid better than this Nepali guy. Why on 45th floor together? One guy gets better pay and the other guy doesn't pay. So there are so many different things happening. It's about time. ILO has a certified office in ILO in Qatar, and we, along with the African Union trade union, we have written a letter to Brother Max in ILO Qatar that from Asia and Africa, those who are working in GCC countries, especially in Qatar, let's have a team there and see the fact that how the final agreement is working there. We want to see that there is no kafala system. You can go out of the no exit visa, and wages are very right. No back wages, things like that. What is publicized by ILO in the view of next year's football match. And I'll tell you again that just half an hour ago, BBC just reported that in view of next year's football match, the workers are much more squeezed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think a lot of interesting points on a collective bargaining power. What does that really look like? Bargaining power of, I guess, also actors like the ILO looking at collective action, I think, among countries of, sending countries as well. And so I think it would be interesting to hear from the participants.
I would like to add one more thing. Sabri invited me to in a government of India's secretary was there, and I told him, why don't you take the lead and that we have a joint negotiation between GCC countries and South Asian regional countries. But they have opened a single window between Bangladesh and Saudi Arabia, Nepal and some other country. Why? Let's have a collective agreement, and let's have a ambassador from GCC countries and office from South Asian SAARC countries, so that we can see that a joint office, so that we can see that the implementation of the agreement, whatever the agreement, I think the agreement is there. If ILO, if we follow the ILO's, what we have signed in ILO conventions, just follow that. That's what the agreement is.
It will be interesting to hear, Mr. Lashman, the reactions that will come in terms of, this is what we're saying. We've known the bargaining power, I think, that you've talked about from the national side. We've also seen what the strength can be in terms of presidential statements. I mean, we saw what Philippines did, for instance, at the abuse of its migrant workers, very vocal from the highest space in the office. So I think that there is something there about the voice and which voice is speaking, and the use of the collective voice. And it would be great to hear from Shabri and also from Rebecca in a moment. Mr. Vesi, please go ahead. If we can try to keep it within 2 minutes so we can get some reflections from everyone. Thank you.
Mr. Basu, you're on mute.
I think you're on mute. Try now. That's
Can you hear me now? I'm audible, right? Thank you. So my cap goes to ILO. Thank you, Nia, for doing a great job for the insight that you have given. And to what Rebecca said, much of these agencies are not known. They are not registered agencies. And sometimes they're taking cutthroat fees that at the end of it all, migrants tend to work for nothing, or some of them tend to hide under the carpet. I want to ask, what can we do to target those unregistered agencies that charge cutthroat fees from migrants? What can we do to see to it that we check their activities? And then the idea on ILO, I want to ask, how are you educating nations? Because sometimes when I hear things like this, I start to wonder, are governments aware? Are government of nations aware that, look, your worker, your citizen is going out somewhere to work 1 month or almost two years free without nothing to take home? And maybe at the end of the 2 years, the work is over and he has to look for somewhere to survive. So what are we doing to educate nations, to educate member nations on things like this? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that prompt and punctual question. I had seen that Dr. Raj had her hand up. Dr. Raj, would you like to come in? Okay, while Dr. Raj is trying to check her mic and so on, who will kick us off? Rebecca, would you like to respond to some of those questions?
Sure, thanks very much. And I suppose responding kind of just collectively at a high level, recognizing we're tight on time. And so I've heard a lot of questions, both around kind of the potential for scaling responsible recruitment markets and practices, and really especially about what does this mean on the ground? What can we do now to improve conditions for migrant workers and to offer them better recruitment channels, right? So Mr. Bassi, I'll kind of latch on to your last question around what we do with agencies that are not known and not registered, or we would put them as kind of those unwilling to abide by responsible practices, either operating through illegal means or charging the migrant workers illegally, et cetera. Our answer as LAMP, and to put it perhaps overly bluntly, would be you crush them through competition. So we tend to group recruitment agencies into 3 different groups. There's the truly responsible agencies who are currently abiding by all of ILO best practice. I could count those probably on both of my hands right now. And they tend to be very small, very mission-driven nonprofits for the most part, from what we're aware of. So for them, what you do is you partner with them and you grow them, right? So you help them become good businesses and you help them to grow. The next group, and this is to our understanding by far the biggest group, is what we would call the strivers. So these are recruitment agencies who are not necessarily, ethical or unethical. They might be interested in responsible practices, especially if you can show them that there's a better market, that they're more profitable if they're ethical and responsible. For them, what you do is first you convert them. And so you teach them about responsible practices, you show them why that's a better business approach, and then you help them convert, and then again, you help them grow, right? And there's, I'm happy to detail at some other point kind of precisely what we think doing to make them grow means. But essentially you partner with them and you make them better businesses and you connect them with employers and you say, this is, a better business proposition for everyone. And then for those who are unregistered, and unwilling to operate by ethical practices, you can't really, from our perspective, right? There is not necessarily a market solution. So all you have to do is just outcompete them. You have to say that the responsible businesses and the strivers that you convert to being responsible businesses are just a better proposition to employers. Employers actually want to work with them either because their costs are somewhat equivalent, or because they're just offering better services, right? So one of the responsible businesses we've worked here with in the H2A, their workers are more productive because they're better trained, they know their rights, they know what they're getting into, right? So you start making that case and saying, actually, this is a better deal for everyone. And you've got to use that to outcompete the bad actors, while of course operating as well, partnering at the regulatory level to enforce that as well. So that's our theory of change. Again, we're kind of at the beginning of testing it, but what we've seen is that this is actually played out elsewhere. So there's a beautiful example from Hong Kong where we've actually seen this tipping point theory work in practice. There was exactly one responsible recruitment agency, the Fair Employment Agency, operating in Hong Kong. And in a span of 5 years, they were able to bring average recruitment costs for the entire market paid down from $2,000 a worker to $700 a worker in the span of 5 years. Now, of course, that's not zero, but it's way better, right? And that was just with one responsible recruitment agency who's now actually running a fund to grow other responsible recruitment agencies. So, we've seen the transformative impact of just one, and that's where LAMP is starting. Let's begin by growing a handful, let's bring others in, and let's outcompete the bad actors. We've seen that theory work in practice, and we hope to have more success to show you in the course of the next few years.
Well, that's great. I think, that's one of the questions actually that was popping up in terms of asking, where has this been a possibility elsewhere? And so that's very good to hear the examples that you're sharing out of Hong Kong. I can see that we have a hand up. Shall we just ask Anelu and Hafsa, if you could do it in a minute each so that we could ask our panelists to respond. Nelu, please go ahead. The floor is yours. Okay, Hafsa, you're unmuted. You can go ahead.
All right.
Go ahead.
Yes, I'm Hafsa. I want to share on my work experience based on just now the Nair has mentioned about the Jordan experience. I'm an auditor, social compliance auditor on the migrant workers, and I have been to a lot of facilities here regarding migrant workers, and on the ground, what is happening is totally different of what you had mentioned. Exactly, just opposite. Shockingly, $6,000 US is the basic amount being charged to the individual agency that you may not know, and we do not know, the employer did not know as well. So the problem is not the agency, the registered agency did not charge, but to whom the employee had paid, they did not even know, they have no receipt, and it is a present from my village. So it is very hard now to detect where are the employer paying to whom are they being paid. So as well as Nepalese, Bangladesh, Myanmar, a lot of them are in Jordan. I'm in Jordan, so I engage with these activities, and I found out the story is completely different. So I think instead of reporting, we have a bilateral agreement, whatever it is, but the employer did not know as well. The company did not know. Until we reported to them, they say, oh no, they did not pay anything. It is a zero payment. They are here, we are paying to them this and this. But the salary chain is different. They were told different story, so I think you got to get into the inside view of the employer and engage with them to get to know what had happened on ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hafsa, that's a very interesting piece of information, I think, for us to also hear, and that's the value that we have, like we always say in the classroom, that we are also learning new content and new ways, and I think your call for more qualitative insights is pointed out and is taken note of. Nelu, would you like to take the floor, and then we can ask Shabri to give us some reactions. Okay, Nelu, Joanne, Gloria, go ahead.
Oh, ma'am,
Nelu, go ahead, and then we'll have Joanne, Gloria.
It's late evening for us. Good evening, ma'am. I just wanted to inform you that being in Qatar there were some laborers who were reporting these problems to us, and they found out that when they were allowed by their employers to come and work in the evening, like they were employed somewhere else as laborers, but on Fridays when it was a holiday, they were given permission to visit houses and do some domestic odd jobs, like cooking in some houses or helping the people, Indians or whichever country they belong. And somehow they said that it is the camp are painful. Their wages are paid them delayed, but when they were allowed to do extra work outside, and they were able to sustain better, because the money which they were earning by working outside their job places, it enabled them to save some money and send more money back home. That was the trend which I am mentioning 5 to 6 years back, and they were complaining of issues of laborers, not only of India, but of other parts of the Asian countries also. But they were happy that they were allowed to earn little extra. I don't know after 5 years what, I am telling you something which is 5 years back. But what is the situation today, the post-COVID era? That has to be, could I get an answer for that little about it? Because
Thanks, Nello. I think that's some good food for thought in terms of, migrant workers themselves sort of going off contract. What does that mean? I mean, in reality, people would always want to make a little bit extra. And I think your reflection is very important. Thinking in the hard times of COVID, what has that meant, and what has that meant in terms of the vulnerabilities that they face? So that will be interesting to hear from our panelists. Jawan, Gloria, we give you a minute, and then we will hand over to Mr. Naif.
Thank you, Ms. Paddy. Mine is just to comment that this is a very insightful discussion, and I'm glad to know and understand that all this unethical recruitment is happening worldwide. I only thought maybe it's my country that things are not happening the right way. Now, there's this situation whereby they say that the prospective employer has paid or has sponsored a migrant worker to pay everything that is required for them to acquire a job, and then in the end they deduct their salary that they are going to earn. Another situation that I have noted is that there's this, they tell them, the migrant workers, that they borrow a loan so that they can, from the recruitment agencies themselves, they're borrowing a loan so that they can sponsor them. And then in the end, the first 2 years or 1 year, they are deducted their salary. So you find that as much as the migrant worker was thinking of earning a better living, they are still just like the way they were at home initially, because they cannot still be able to make up for the year they have lost repaying the agency. And another issue that I have noted is that the recruitment agencies, upon having restrictions by the government so that they can curb these rogue recruitment agencies, they are failing to meet those requirements. Thus, they have initiated a different way whereby they take a migrant worker in the name of visiting the destination country. And upon reaching there, they are given a job that is of less value. It's not of standard. It doesn't meet the minimum requirement that is needed for a migrant to earn. And that is what has now come up to be the issue that is happening in my country. So I don't know how we can help each other so that we can be able to cap all these issues. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much. Jawan, Gloria, remind me, I think you're in Kenya, isn't it?
Yes, I'm in Kenya.
Yes.
I'm a Kenyan.
Okay, just to give our panelists context of where you are, but I think very interesting aspects that you've shared here with us for them to take note as they will be responding. I see that now it's okay. We ask Ms. Musharuddin.
Patty, I'm going to quickly come in here, and I'm sure Musharuddin's points are going to be very important. I have to leave, unfortunately, in the next couple of minutes. So I'm going to take the liberty, Musharuddin, brother, I'm sincerely apologetic for coming in this way, but just to make a few final remarks from my side. You know, when I hear people like Hafsa, Neelu, even John's points now, and of course, Lakshmanji right at the beginning, it is proof, Rebecca, for us, when we talk about that beautiful theory of change, we can find 100 other market forces who are going to try and find loopholes in what we think will be an effective theory of change, right? And that is exactly the problem. I mean, you know, if I were to link all these points that have been mentioned to the question that was raised by Mr. Bassi with regards to what is the ILO doing to educate governments? You know, I've just left from, usually, I'm posted out of New Delhi. New Delhi is the capital of India where most UN officials are posted. Now, as you know, UN officials have got a separate passport. It's what we call the United Nations laissez-passer, which is the travel document on which UN officials travel. When I go to the immigration officer in Delhi with my UN LP, he or she automatically recognizes it because it's Delhi. And as I said, this is where all UN officials are posted. But this time around, I left from the south of India where my family is based. And I kid you not, almost every immigration officer sitting in that airport, in that international airport, had a look at my UNLP, right? So Mr. Bassi, when you talk about educating, I wouldn't use that word. I would think more in terms of spreading the word on certain aspects. You know, it is always a constant learning. That said, do you really think that our government officials or our partners, whether they are even the UN or trade unions or social employers or recruitment agencies or others, don't really know the issues? They know the issues. It's not that they don't. I would really, you know, we better not be naive in thinking that they don't know what's happening. They know what is happening. They know the realities on the ground, but they look at it from very different perspectives. For instance, if you go to the Ministry of External Affairs and ask them and tell them about these issues, they will tell you, oh, we know, Mr. Bassi, thank you very much, very important points. However, our relationships with the government in the countries of destination is more important than what you're saying. If you go to the Ministry of Labor will give you a totally different perspective to what the Ministry of External Affairs gives you or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs gives you, right? So in each country, a government is not a monolithic or not a monolith in terms of how it views things, right? Everybody within that government, depending on the ministry they come from, depending on the department they come from, depending on the individual that is working at that desk, you will see views and perspectives vary from person to person, government to government, ministry to ministry, and so on. There is another angle to it. Let us not look at fair recruitment in its isolation. Let's not look at migration in isolation. Migration is linked, or fair recruitment is linked to the fact that in my country, in India, 90% of people working in my country are in the informal sector. 90%. So only 10% of Indian working population is actually paying taxes. The rest, 90%, are in the informal sector. Now, that is where you will see a lot of unfair recruitment happening. So if you want to stem unfair recruitment, address informality in the country. If you want to stem unfair recruitment, address corruption in the country, make it more transparent. If you want to stem unfair recruitment in your country, address issues of poverty. If you want to stem unfair recruitment in your country, make sure that you have a whole of government approach. Make sure that you're talking to everybody in the society. It's what we call the whole of society approach, that like the GCM talks about. But that, unfortunately, is not happening. So to address these issues, we need to look at the broader issues that link into migration, because migration doesn't work in isolation. So my friends, since you're all in the GCM certificate course, go back to looking at Objective 2. Objective 2, which talks about addressing drivers of migration, right? Adverse drivers of migration is actually perhaps the preeminent perspective that needs to be looked at within the entirety of the GCM to make sure that there are more flexible and legal pathways, that there is more fair recruitment, that there is better pre-departure orientation, that there is better consular assistance. And if we can address that, I think we would have much more a better implementation of all these other aspects that people like Hafsa and Neelu and John and Lakshmanji and Mr. Bassi have brought up. I'll stop there, Paddy. Thanks so much for having me. Rebecca, as a pleasure as always. Everybody else, you know, my way of concluding is always to say, I love you. Thank you so much for having me. Binod sir, bye-bye to you as well. Paddy, I take your leave now. Bye-bye.
Gabri, thank you very much for having been with us. And as we are going to actually also wrap up, because we are conscious of the time, just again to say thank you for sharing your insights, but with a lot of passion, but I think with also a lot of honesty and depth in understanding what the realities look like in the face of a global compact for migration as grand and objective, you know, on fair recruitment and decent work. And I feel that we didn't even touch much of the side on the side of decent work. But I think we touched on some aspects of it. And I think what you said in the very end about us looking at our society. So we're looking at the homelands, we're looking at the host countries. There's a lot of work that has to be done before we talk about, you know, systems that have to do with fair recruitment as well. But, you know, the work doesn't stop there. Again, thank you to Rebecca. And thanks again to Kimberly in absentia, who have, you know, just shown us how we have to think differently. We really have to open our minds and, you know, thinking a bit like, I think the young lady from Kenya who spoke, I think at COP26, where she was saying at the COP26, where she basically said, you know, maybe we need to start listening to our hearts. And this is the kind of, you know, somebody said, we're not using artificial intelligence, but we're using artificial intelligence. And maybe there, you know, we have some authentic answers coming a bit from within. And this is all going back to us treating each other with respect, looking at migrants and trying to ensure that, you know, their human rights are respected as they move to improve their livelihoods. And so what does it look like in terms of facilitating this movement for fair recruitment? What does it look like in terms of, you know, the work conditions that they've been attached to? And as always, you know, for students, we always say the conversation continues in the Google Classroom. Please feel free to ask any questions that you would have there. And then I think we'll also be sharing some of the resources Rebecca and Kim have also shared the website of the work that they're doing so that we can continue following that. Because like Mr. Basis said, how do we educate each other? I think it's by taking a leaf from what we have here and passing it on to colleagues, passing it on to friends and others where you engage on migration governance. My name is Paddy Sianga Knudsen from JRFDT, thanking you for your time. And for others, it's still morning in the Americas. I think, Rebecca, it's still morning. I hope you're on to your second coffee. I'm going to have my last one here in the Balkans. Good afternoon to people in Africa and in Europe, and good evening and good night for those joining us from Asia Pacific. Thank you for your patience and your time, and take care, everyone. Bye-bye. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks very much, Paddy. It was a pleasure to be here with you all and learn so much from all of your comments.
Oh, yes, indeed. I think it won't be the first and last time we'll have you, I'm sure.
I'm sure.